Sophie and the Angel by Dora Alonso. Sophie was way past 80 and wrapped herself up in dark clothes. Her blouse was decorated with an old gold and enamel brooch shaped like a fig leaf. She was not shy, just very discreet. Flattened and diminished by age, she seemed like a bit of crumpled paper blown about by the wind, gliding, stopping at times, starting up and bouncing along, steadied by the parasol she used as a cane. Just listening, you could tell when she was passing by, given away by the tapping of the tip of the parasol. You came to associate two sharp, small eyes and a pair of bushy eyebrows with it. Her hair was always neatly done, two small combs holding the white mane in check. In spite of her appearance, the old lady had a busy spiritual life and didn't seem to be bored in her hillside home. She occupied all the recesses and shelves, as comfy in each room as a crab in its shell. She easily negotiated the big rambling house in the dark and would stroll in the patio under the same leafy tamarind tree that had witnessed her forebears coming and going in their carriages. The house on the hillside had been in the family forever. Some great-grandmother, dispatched in a fit of rage by her jealous husband next to the ancient tree, seemed to hold her descendants in thrall within the walls of the ruined manor. Sophie was the last in the line. Her small, lonely figure was practically invisible to her neighbors, although they often noticed the tapping of her parasol. She chirped or mumbled her greetings and ended up fading into the street and its surroundings. During the past few years, things had changed. Life and novelty swirled around the forgotten wreath she had become, although she refused to take notice. Ensconced among the begonias and old furniture, she defied and loathed change. Sophie was left completely alone when Agueda, her old servant and only companion, suddenly departed. Agueda had died, feather duster in hand, before a painting of the Sacred Heart. Even if the strange events to come weren't her fault, she was eventually blamed for them. Agueda, unlike the other woman, was constituted of 1 part laundry soap and 1 part reality, the human reality of motherhood several times over. She counterbalanced Sophie, ready to pull her back to the real world when Sophie got overly absorbed in her church visits and commerce with celestial figures. Even though Agueda assiduously dusted the altars and saints, she was part of the new life around them, learning about volunteer work and all the new ideas in the air. She suddenly died, however, leaving Sophie abandoned to her incessant devotions, more isolated than she had ever been before. The flowers on her tomb were still moist when Sophie had her first hallucination. It was 7:30, and Sophie was starting to nod off in her sitting room rocking chair in the chiaroscuro of the evening. Then the cat came walking up to her on its hind legs, head bowed, distinctly announcing, "Warm up some coffee. You have a visitor." The angel made his entrance before she had time to react. She didn't realize he was an angel at first, even if she had seen him gliding along the ridged roof in full tunic, tied at the waist with a red cord. She would have seen him carrying an electric guitar instead of a lyra. He was a seraphic figure, looking about 20 years old, with short, shoulder-length hair and beautiful smiling eyes. His sandals glowed softly golden, and the cat rubbed up against them immediately as soon as he sat down. Sophie fell to her knees and couldn't get up. The radiant spirit moved his hand as if to pick up something in the air, and an unknown force picked her up and set her down in her chair, where she sat in ecstasy. When she came to, the sun was tinged with blue as it filtered through the frosted glass of the sitting room windows. Sophie shuddered as she recalled what had happened. Anxiously, she called the cat, but as she cautiously examined the small black animal, he looked so inoffensive and unremarkable that she calmed down and wrote it off all as a dream. That night in her room, she arranged some flowers on the altar and lighted a small lamp under the image of the Virgin. Kneeling where Gueda had collapsed amid clouds of dust, she kissed one of the family relics and prayed for a long time. Once her prayers were done, she got ready for bed. Wearing a chaste nightgown, she climbed onto the bed as if it were a burial mound. The room was stuffy. Street noises seemed to filter in from another world. A child screaming, a bus, neighborhood committee announcements over a loudspeaker. The punctual 9 o'clock cannon reverberated through the house like a warning as Sophie mumbled her last prayers for the evening. At the muffled explosion, the cat jumped off the kneeler cushion where he usually slept curled up, and walking on his hind legs, went to the bedroom door and opened it. The delicious aroma of guava flooded the room, and Sophie noticed that her fingers were covered with rings. She trembled like a sheet of paper inside her large gown as something leapt inside her chest. The angel smiled at her by her bedside. He played his guitar for a long while, lulling Sophie to sleep. After the second time, the messenger of light did not startle her anymore, and his visits became regular. On the 15th one, he brought her a young unicorn. Sophie was delighted, and within a week the small beast had learned to follow her around and eat from her hand. After the unicorn came a clepsydra, which helped amuse her as she awaited his next appearance. She had no doubts about the celestial credentials of her visitor, although at one time she considered going to confession for guidance and advice. She desisted, however, fearing criticism of the unusual relationship that now occupied her, so things just stayed the way they were. Their familiarity grew all the time until it took an unexpected turn, revealing something hitherto well concealed in the lengthy canasta, games, and conversation. They sat very close to each other on the couch in the half-light of the spacious living room as they shared the delicious old-fashioned sweets and fresh lemonade that Sophie had made herself, singing as she prepared them. Long-forgotten whims of the distant young lady she had had suddenly come into bloom. Like a mischievous child, she would occasionally muss her friend's feathers with a small wrinkled and veined hand, and just to please her, the spirit of light would demonstrate takeoffs, hover, and fly around. Her smiling eyes would follow him to where he would land back in the patio, alighting under the tamarind where the remains of her great-grandmother sweetened its sour fruits. In the intimacy of those hours under the foliage, they exchanged confidences. She told him of her childhood, her languid youth, her religious aspirations, and about the late Agueda. He talked about his position in the last of the 9 choirs, frequent missions on behalf of divine providence, and sacred mysteries. And, perceiving his attentive listener's uneasiness about his true identity, he cunningly reassured her about the rightness of it all, how they were no longer bound by outmoded prudery and old-fashioned hypocrisy. Sophie would just sigh, trusting him and going along with everything. She often thought that she was living in a delightful dream. Saturdays had been set aside for dancing, and the music from the radio wrapped them up in its sensual cadences. If for some reason her seraphic fiancé failed to appear, Sophie, impatient, would not hide her jealousy. Little quarrels would burst out, warming the encounters and farewells. One evening there was a kiss. How she wept, clutching her pillow. The very idea of falling into mortal sin drove her to despair, and she beat her breast in vain as the pounding merely echoed the same rhythm as that of her lover's music. Upset, exasperated, she mistreated the cat, doubled her prayers, and refused to feed the unicorn. "This has to stop," she would repeat fearfully, "once and for all." Several days later, after much sorrow and deliberation, she informed the angel of her decision. She had not reckoned, however, that her spirited suitor would be incapable of waiting for her or giving her up. Stubborn and incensed by her drastic breaking off, he thoroughly shocked her with his cunningly insolent and lascivious behavior. In between riffs on his guitar, he would suddenly lift the skirts of the abashed lady, who would run off, unable to escape his importunings. The house no longer smelled of guava when he came, but of an unknown and disturbing fragrance that weakened Sophie's knees, embarrassing her. All the tricks in the book were being used against her, and when she realized that she could not hold out much longer, she decided to take matters to the top, though not before a judicious quantity of contrite tears. The frightened virgin scribbled long, revealing letters in a trembling hand, describing her trials and the traps and designs against her chastity, how the bed would get undone as soon as she had made it, how her panties would not lie straight in the dresser, and how he would show up in her bathtub with nothing except his crossed wings. The astonished nuncio secretly forwarded the report to the parish priest with instructions to clear things up as tactfully and discreetly as possible. She was to be made to understand how sinful and unhealthy her illusions had become. Sophie listened to the fatherly admonishment with bowed head. Firm but gentle reasoning convinced her of her mistake, and she was invited to make a sincere confession of it. Obedient and very much comforted, Sophie spoke candidly for a long while. She gratefully accepted the conclusions of her religious advisor, who blamed not her, but the isolation in which she was living and her wandering imagination given full play by her idleness. Sophie told of her imagined encounters, quarrels, and reconciliations with the celestial spirit. She was not interrupted except for a brief comment on the participation of a cat, and a black cat at that, in the episode. Sophie was involved in exchange for a definite promise to get rid of the cat and to come right back at the first sign of further irregularities. The old lady was filled with joy. With devout pride, she showed the priest her bedroom, the well cared for altar, holy images, kneeler. The parish priest nodded, satisfied that he had handled things in the best possible way. There was, unfortunately, a long white feather of unquestionably angelic origin poking out luridly and inexcusably from beneath the sheets of her bed.